Alright nerds, so now we're going to talk about galvanic cells or voltaic cells, both the same thing. This is not a new creation. This is in fact very, very old technology, and it's named after an Italian guy called Galvani, and let's get into it. So basically, what's the point? The point is you want to understand the workings of a galvanic cell. There's a lot to it. It's a fairly complex procedure, so be prepared to pause, take your time, and move on as we go. Alright, so if you see over here, here is our galvanic cell. We've got a zinc electrode in a zinc, in this case it says zinc nitrate, zinc sulfate, zinc nitrate will do. Copper electrode in a copper nitrate, copper sulfate solution. There is a salt bridge, which can be just something as simple as a filter paper that is soaked in potassium nitrate, okay, and you've got a voltmeter. So these are connected by a wire. A voltmeter, now remember voltage is potential difference, so it's the amount of energy on one side or the other. So it's basically the amount of energy that is able to push through this wire. Alright, so let's have a look at it. So a galvanic cell or a voltaic cell, we use it to produce electrical energy, which is electricity is a flow of electrons. So we're producing a flow of electrons from a redox reaction. So a flow of electrons from a chemical reaction. This works because redox reactions are electron transfer reactions. So the electrons transfer from one substance to another. Basically, to allow this to occur, we separate the two different metals. In this case, you can see it's a metal displacement reaction. We separate them into two half cells. So here's a half cell here, and here's a half cell there. Normally, it would be zinc in copper nitrate, copper sulfate, doesn't matter. So what we've done is we've actually separated the zinc and the copper sulfate. We'll say copper sulfate from now on, so we'll imagine that they are little O4s, little sulfate ions. So we've got zinc and copper sulfate. Alright, so let's see how this goes. You basically got a conducting wire which allows the electrons to flow. We have the salt bridge which completes the circuit and does something else which we'll get to in a minute. And remember, the reduction reaction happens at the cathode, and the oxidation reaction happens at the anode, and that's where anox and red cat come into it earlier, so from the previous lesson. So reduction at the cathode, at the anode we have oxidation. Now, if you just have a look down here, you'll see on the left hand side we have zinc and zinc ion, okay, so that's your oxidation, and copper ion and copper, so there it gains the electrons, and here it loses the electrons, so reduction, oxidation. So the reduction happens at the cathode, and that's on the right hand side, and this setup here actually represents our galvanic cell. Okay, so you've got the anode here, cathode. This is a half cell for oxidation over here, half cell for reduction, and you'll see that it is separated by a salt bridge. Okay, so that's the way to write that down, and we can actually work out roughly, well not roughly, exactly in theory, how much energy or potential energy can be produced just by writing that out as it is there. Okay, so how do we set up the galvanic cell? The galvanic cell we're going to talk about for now is basically a metal displacement one with zinc at the anode and copper at the cathode. Okay, so red cat, yeah, reduction, cathode, anox, anode, oxidation. Okay, so how do we set it up? These are our reactions. Remember those. We've seen those a million times now. So basically, you've got two cells set up. So here's cell, half cell one, half cell two, and you have in this side zinc sulfate and zinc, copper sulfate, copper. That's actually called an analyte couple. Okay, so your zinc and your zinc sulfate, copper sulfate. Now they're connected by a wire that goes across, and the salt bridge through there. And the salt bridge in this case is filled with potassium nitrate. We use potassium nitrate quite commonly because it doesn't form precipitation. So if you get a precipitate in there, it'll block the flow of ions, as we'll see in a second. So the chemical reaction, all right, it's as we've seen before, but now separated out. So the zinc oxidizes. This means it loses electron. So you've got a zinc atom here. It loses 2 electrons. They go off into the wire over to the copper. Okay, so your zinc loses 2 electrons. It oxidizes. It goes across. And that zinc ion, it leaves the electrode and goes into solution. So as you can see here, zinc ion goes into solution. Now, this means that over time, this electrode here will deteriorate and get smaller and more worn down. Okay, now, but that's the oxidation side. So the electron goes across here, pushes the voltmeter and sets it off, or a light, or whatever you want there. And then we've got the other side, the copper. So the copper reduces. It takes the electron and it pulls one of these copper ions from copper sulfate onto the electrode. Okay, so electron comes in, that draws in a copper ion. It's going to deposit on top of that electron. So the electrode. What that actually means is, while this one reduces, this one will gain mass as the copper adds on. Okay, and that's one way to test if your experiment's working, and we will have a look at this. We'll have a look at the masses before and after. Okay, so the electrons are received through the wire, and the copper comes out of solution onto the electrode, and that's reduction. Now, we'll continue on with just a little bit more to go on this. So as the zinc is slowly oxidized, more zinc ions build up in here, okay, and obviously less copper ions are going to be in here. This is where the salt bridge comes into it. So on this side, as the zinc ions go in, we're going to have more zinc than sulfate ions, and we'll get a positive charge. Over this side, we're going to have more sulfate ions than we will copper, so we get a negative charge. Now, for the cell to work, we need that neutral charge. Okay, so we need it to be neutral in here and neutral in there. So what do? Well, that's where the salt bridge really comes into it. So the salt bridge completes the circuit. All right, so you need your complete circuit. You don't stress, but in this case, you need a complete circuit. And what is it going to do? It's got another function. Basically, as the electrons leave, these here will become out of balance. The salt bridge allows us to maintain electron neutrality. So as this fills up with, so the charge in the two of them stays 0. So as this one here fills up with zinc ions, the nitrate will come out of, see, the nitrate will come out of the salt bridge into the solution to keep it neutral. All right. Now, in this one here, as the copper ions leave, it'll become increasingly negative. So the potassium ions enter into this solution. Okay, and that helps us maintain the neutrality, and that's important. Again, when the nitrates go in, it doesn't tend to make any precipitations at all. So it doesn't react. It stays in solution. All right. So as the ions, as we allow those ions to flow, we can keep the balance in charge. Now, what we actually could do is we could not have a salt bridge, but just have a porous barrier. So unglazed ceramics, that'll do it. That will allow the ions to travel across, and that will do the same thing. But in the lab, we tend to have the salt bridge there. All right, so these are just our simple definitions. An electrode is anything which it passes through, the current passes through, sorry, and basically they're metal conductors put into the electrolytes. They can be reactive or unreactive. This PT is platinum. The electrolyte is the solution, okay? that it's in. So all salt solutions are electrolytes, but not all salts are soluble, so that's worth remembering. It needs to be soluble. And they contain free cations and anions, and you should know this by now. But basically, electrons can't travel through electrolytes, and that's why we need the wire, because the electrons can't travel through an electrolyte. They have to be attached to an ion, essentially. The anode and the cathode refer to the two electrodes. Okay, the anode is oxidized, the cathode is reduced. So the electrons flow from the anode to the cathode. All right, don't stress about this. Ignore that. That's there for later on. All right, that was a big one. The next one will be much shorter, I promise. All right, see you.